As far as I'd been told, Avery's well had been sealed over for years. It stood around a quarter mile off the path in the middle of Acres Woods and had served to provide drinking water to the people of Morton for as far back as the records went. Records had also made note of how the well had been sealed up several times before in its history, but which did not explain when it was sunk or by whom, or how long it had actually been there. Nor did it explain why the residents chose to keep sealing it up. Why the residents of the town would choose to cover over a perfectly good well back in the days before plumbing, only to unseal it a few decades later, isn't really explained. We just have to assume that the cover was removed in the intervening period because otherwise there would be no reason to cover it over again, as the residents of the parish did at large ceremonies in 1599, 1772, and again in 1806. With the advent of modern plumbing and sanitation, the well was presumably disregarded as an outdated anachronism. A relic of the past, but not something that was of practical use. Despite this, it was sealed up yet again in 1977, and that time my grandfather not only saw it happen, but helped seal it. He used to talk about how he and his friends were there the day that it was finally shut over. How some older fellas that he'd worked with put lengths of wood over the circular mouth of the well in crisscross slats, nailed a board to it, and then covered the whole thing with plaster and cement. He even said that a week after the hole was sealed, he, his mate Joe, and a few others were hired by the council to put another layer of bricks and mortar over the top of the seal, wait for it to dry, and then plaster over that layer too. When I asked him why they went to so much trouble to seal it up so thoroughly, he would go very quiet. It's a weird thing about Morton, you know. A lot of people tend to go missing. One minute they're here, the next they're gone. Now, obviously, in a big city, when folks disappear, nobody really notices, but in a small town like this, people talk. Most times, a person just had enough of small town life and has moved back to the city or somewhere else looking for work. But when it's kids that have gone missing, then people pay more attention. 3 of them there were, who vanished over the space of about a year. Nobody ever proved that they'd fallen down the well, but you know what public hysteria is like. Everyone knew that the kids used to play and build dens in the woods close to the well, and in fact it was there open and unused. People just put 2 and 2 together and assumed that that's what happened. So the council decided to seal it over to stop anyone else falling in. When I asked why nobody had gone down into the well to see if the kids were down in there, my grandfather simply shrugged, explaining that the idea was just a rumor, that nobody really knew if the kids had gone down there, and that it would be too risky to send somebody else down on a fool's errand. Easier to just seal it up, I reckon. Plus, nobody had gotten water from it in years. You don't know how far down that well actually goes. It was the last phrase that as a kid always struck in my mind. Presumably, the surface of the water flowing from the old well can't have been that low down, or else the locals would not have been able to pull the water up from it. But then, the surface of the water wasn't actually the bottom, was it? How far down it actually went was a mystery, and for some reason, the idea of it gave me the creeps. I always used to imagine looking down into that black circular hole, like a tunnel leading down into the darkness. I used to imagine that the hole was like a bottomless pit, a space that went on forever, and that if you ever fell in, you would not eventually hit the water, but would rather keep falling forever. As a child, I remembered having nightmares about the well, and about the hideous things that might be lurking down there in the black. Things that might emerge every few years to snatch a child and make it necessary for the locals to seal the top of the well. My fears of a bottomless pit were proven false in 1999. The well could not have been bottomless because someone had fallen in. I first heard about the noises from the well in a 5th period math lesson whilst at school. I was 16 years old, in year 11, the last year before leaving high school, and could not wait for the seconds on the lesson to tick by so that my friends and I could ride our bikes to Acres Woods and check on the old well. The rumor had come to me via a friend who had been told by their friend, but by the time we left school that day, everybody had heard. Up until that point, I had never actually been up there to see the well. I knew where it was in the woods, but as far as I knew from my granddad, it was sealed over. So why would I go look? Clearly though, if someone had fallen in, it must have been open, and I for one wanted to see it. I remember riding along the dirt path, all of us dropping our bikes by the side of the road before wandering through the greenery to a clearing where around a dozen adults were gathered around the hole. The well itself was a stone ring that jutted out from the ground to a height of around 3 feet. It was covered over with moss and vines, so that it looked in some ways as if the well itself had grown out of the ground with them. The brick, or rather stone that the well was made up of, was ancient. The same sort of rock that you saw used in dry stone walls up in the hills or the old field walls that had been standing for centuries. There was no sign on the well or around it of the modern bricks, mortar, or plaster that had been used to seal the top off. Presumably, these modern materials must have fallen in. Perhaps I remember saying to my best friend, the boards and woods became rotten and the modern materials collapsed inwards, falling into the well itself, and that was why there was no trace of them. Whatever the reason, they were gone. All that remained in their place was a large black hole. It's hard to explain, but even from my position at the edge of the clearing behind the small crowd of adults, I could see that there was something not quite right about the darkness. The black inside the well was not just a darkness created by the absence of light as the depth increased. It was like something that was being held in there, resting within the circular frame of the well's entrance. It was black like darkness, and yet it seemed somehow too dark, too black to be just shadow. It might have been a trick of the light, but the dark in that hole looked solid, as if it had volume or weight. My reflections on this topic were soon interrupted when I heard the first hideous wail ringing and echoing from inside the well and the terrified sobs that came after. One of the gathered adults shouted down into the well, reassuring whoever was down there that they would soon be rescued, that the fire brigade were on their way, and that they just needed to sit tight. Questions about the victim's name, whether they were hurt, or how they had fallen in remained unanswered, and were met instead by the same hideous howling and sobbing as of a child in great pain. When the fire brigade did turn up, we were asked to leave. There was, they said, nothing we could do to help, and the gathered crowd would only get in the way. So reluctantly, my friends and I hoisted up our bikes and set off home, the thin sound of the trapped child's wails still ringing in my ears. The following morning at school, I asked my friend Eddie whether the child had been rescued. He was shocked that I hadn't heard. Nobody was rescued, he said solemnly. But one of the firefighters didn't come out. Shocked by the blunt matter-of-fact nature of this statement, I quizzed Eddie about what happened. He said that obviously he wasn't there, but his brother was on the fire brigade force that had attended. They sent one guy down on a rope, he said. The kid was still crying, so they thought the descent couldn't be too far. It's a horrible way to think about it, but if it was a really big drop, the kid wouldn't have survived. Anyway, this fireman goes down being slowly lowered on the rope by the others. The kid is still crying, but after a while, the fireman gets so low they can't see him anymore. They kept lowering and lowering, but after a while they realize they're gonna run out of rope, and he isn't actually going to be able to ascend down any further. They try getting in touch with him on his walkie-talkie or radio or whatever, and there's no reply. Just the sound of the kid crying, still coming up out of the hole. I nodded that I understood and encouraged Eddie to go on, which strangely for him, he seemed reluctant to do. Perhaps I thought the idea that it could have been his brother on the end of that rope had shaken him up a bit. Eventually though, slowly, he resumed the story. They kept lowering until the rope hit its furthest length. The kid was still crying, so they waited a minute or two. But then something weird happened. "What?" I asked, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. "The rope snapped," Eddie said flatly, and the crying turned into laughter. Someone down there was laughing and laughing and laughing. When I asked what happened next, Eddie became a little sheepish, but after a moment he agreed to tell me if I didn't mention it to anyone. I agreed, and in a half whisper, he said, "They used another rope to send a camera down to see if they could find the firemen who'd gone down there. The camera had a light in it so they could see what they were filming. After they got the extent of rope, they pulled it back up again and rewound to see if they'd caught anything in film." Eddie paused, took a deep breath and said, "Only the chief watched the footage. My brother said that he turned white and that he saw tears rolling down his cheeks." Without digging the guy out or sending any other equipment down there, he ordered them to seal it up, all while something continued to laugh. Eddie's words sound far-fetched, but it's a matter of public record that there was an inquest launched into the fireman's death, and that the results of that inquest were suppressed and made available to the public. The official explanation given to the press was that an animal had become trapped down there, that the fireman, who had become a hero, had been killed in a tragic accident down there caused by a release of noxious gas. He had asphyxiated and fallen to his death. The body was never recovered because the site had to be sealed off as quickly as possible in order to protect the public. The records will now show at least 4 times that well in Acres Woods has been sealed off. I often wonder if it will ever be opened again, either by those at the surface looking for an explanation, or perhaps from below by whatever is hiding beneath.